Guys, good morning. We're back for day 2 of our read aloud from the wishing spell. I know that some people really like to have the book in front of them to follow along. I like that too. So I don't know how Amazon's doing with getting packages to people right now, but that would be an option to buy the Land of Stories, the wishing spell on Amazon. Or I had a parent reach out to me and let me know that Kindle Unlimited is doing 2-month free trials. So that could be helpful. If not, just go ahead and enjoy and read along. But those are just options to help support the author if you're interested and follow along as I read to you. So we're going to start at chapter 1. Yesterday we did the prologue. So this is chapter 1, Once Upon a Time. And our setting is going to change. So pay attention because I'm going to ask you, where does this take place right now? Where's our setting? Once upon a time, Mrs. Peters said to her 6th grade class, "These are the most magical words our world has ever known and the gateway into the greatest stories ever told. They're an immediate calling to anyone who hears them, a calling into a world where everyone is welcome and anything can happen. Mice can become men, maids can become princesses, and they teach valuable lessons in the process." Alex Bailey sat eagerly up in her seat. She usually enjoyed her teacher's lessons, but this was something especially close to her heart. "Fairy tales are more than silly bedtime stories," the teacher continued. "The solution to almost every problem imaginable can be found in the outcome of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are life lessons disguised with colorful characters and situations." We've talked about this in class before. What is it called when you get the life lesson from a story? What is that? When a story teaches you a life lesson. It's called the theme, right? So fairy tales have themes often. "The Boy Who Cried Wolf" teaches us the value of good reputation and the power of honesty. "Cinderella" shows us the rewards of having a good heart. "The Ugly Duckling" teaches us the meaning of inner beauty. Alex's eyes were wide, and she nodded in agreement. She was a pretty girl with bright blue eyes and short strawberry blonde hair that was always kept neatly out of her face with a headband. So right now we're getting some of Alex's physical characteristics. Let's see if we can find anything about her thoughts, words, and actions that are going to help us make inferences about her personality characteristics. Be looking for those, okay? I'm also going to ask you about the teacher. That was Max jumping to look out the window. The way the other students stared at their teacher, as if the lesson were being taught in another language, was something Miss Peters had never grown accustomed to. Listen for clues about the character traits of Miss Peters. Ready? So Miss Peters would often direct entire lessons in front of the room where Alex sat. Miss Peters was a tall, thin woman who always wore dresses that resembled old patterned sofas. Her hair was dark and curly and sat perfectly on top of her head like a hat, and her students often thought it was. Through a pair of thick glasses, her eyes were permanently squinted from all the judgmental looks she had given her classes over the years. "Sadly, these timeless tales are no longer relevant in our society," Miss Peters said. "We have traded their brilliant teachings for small-minded entertainment like television and video games. Parents now let obnoxious cartoons and violent movies influence their children. The only exposure to the tales some children acquire are versions changed by film companies. Fairy tale adaptations are usually stripped of every moral lesson the stories were originally intended to teach, and replaced with singing and dancing forest animals. I recently read that the films are being created depicting Cinderella as a struggling hip-hop dancer and Sleeping Beauty as a warrior princess battling zombies." "Awesome," a student behind Alex whispered to himself. Alex shook her head. Hearing this made her soul hurt. She tried to share her disapproval with her fellow classmates, but sadly, her concern was not reciprocated. What do you think reciprocated means? She tried to share her disapproval with her fellow classmates, but sadly, her concern was not reciprocated. "I wonder if the world would be a different place if everyone knew the tales the way the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen intended them to be known," Miss Peters said. "I wonder if people would learn from the Little Mermaid's heartbreak when she dies at the end of the real story. I wonder if there would be so many kidnappings if children were shown the true dangers that Little Red Riding Hood was facing. I wonder if delinquents would be so inclined to misbehave if they knew the consequences Goldilocks caused for herself with the three bears. There is just so much to learn and prevent for our futures if we would just open our eyes to past teachings. Perhaps if we embraced fairy tales as much as we could, it would be much easier to find our own happily ever afters. If Alex had her way, Miss Peters would be rewarded with thunderous applause after each lesson she gave. Unfortunately, all that followed her classes was a mutual sign of relief among students, thankful that they were over. "Let's see how well you know all of your fairy tales," the teacher said with a smile, and began pacing the room. "And Rumpelstiltskin, what did the young maiden's father tell the king that his daughter could spin into hay? Does anyone know?" Sorry, spin hay into. Does anyone know? Do you guys know? And Rumpelstiltskin, what did the young maiden's father say that his daughter could spin hay into? Do you remember that story? Miss Peters scanned the classroom like a shark looking for wounded fish. What type of figurative language is that? It's comparing using like or as. It's comparing the comparing the teacher to a shark looking for wounded fish. What type is that? Only one student raised her hand. Who do you think is raising her hand right now? "Yes, Miss Bailey," Miss Peters called. "He claimed she could spin hay into gold," Alex said. "Very good, Miss Bailey," Miss Peters said. If she had a favorite student, not that she would ever admit to having one, Alex would have been it. Alex was always eager to please. She was the definition of a bookworm. It didn't matter what time of day it was, before school, during school, after school, before bed. She was always reading. She had a thirst for knowledge, and because of it, Alex was usually the first person to answer Miss Peters' questions. She tried her best to impress her classmates with every chance she got, putting extra effort into each book report and class presentation she was assigned. However, this usually annoyed the other students, and Alex was often teased for it. What character traits can we assign to Alex right now? If you could sum her up in a couple words, what would you say? She constantly heard the other girls making fun of her behind her back. She usually spent lunch alone under a tree somewhere with an open library book. Although she would never tell anyone, Alex was so lonely that sometimes it hurt. Now, can anyone tell me what the compromise was that the maiden made with Rumpelstiltskin? What's a compromise? You have to know that to be able to answer this. Can anyone tell me what the compromise was that the maiden made with Rumpelstiltskin? Alex waited for a moment before she put her hand up. She didn't want to seem like a total teacher's pet. "Yes, Miss Bailey. In exchange for turning the hay into gold, the maiden promised to give Rumpelstiltskin her firstborn child when she became queen," Alex explained. "That's a pretty steep deal," a boy said behind Alex. What would a creepy old short man want with a baby anyway?" the girl next to him asked. "Obviously, he couldn't adopt one with a name like Rumpelstiltskin," another student added. "Did he eat the baby?" someone else asked nervously. Alex turned around to face her clueless peers. "You're all missing the point of the story," Alex said. "Rumpelstiltskin took advantage of the maiden because she was in need. This story is about the price of a bad negotiation. What are we willing to give up long-term in the future for something short-term in the present?" She's identifying the theme, isn't she? Do you get it? If Miss Peters could change her facial expression, she would have looked very proud. "Nicely put, Miss Bailey," she said. "I must say, in all of my years of teaching, I've rarely come across a pupil with as much in-depth knowledge as—" A loud snore suddenly came from the back of the classroom. A boy in the back row was slouched over his desk and drooling from the corner of his mouth, very much asleep. Ready for this part? Alex had a twin brother. And it was moments like these that made her wish she didn't. Miss Peters diverted her attention to him like a paper clip to a magnet. Ooh, figurative language. Her attention is being compared to a paper clip being attracted to a magnet. What type of figurative language is that? Mr. Bailey? Mrs. Peters asked. He continued to snore. Shh. Mr. Bailey? Miss Peters asked again, kneeling down close to him. He let out another enormous snore. A few students wondered how it was possible for such a loud noise to come out of him. Mr. Bailey! Miss Peters shouted in his ear. As if someone lit a firework under his seat, Connor Bailey jumped back to life, almost knocking his desk over. What? Where am I? What happened? Connor asked in a panicked state of confusion. His eyes darted around the room while his brain tried to remember where he was. Like his sister, he also had bright blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. His face was round and freckled, and in the moment, slightly smudged to one side like a basset hound when he first wakes up from a nap. More figurative language there, comparing using like or as. Alex couldn't have been more embarrassed by her brother. Besides sharing looks and a birth date, she and her brother couldn't have been more different. Connor may have had a lot of friends, but unlike his sister, he had trouble in school. Mostly, trouble staying awake. I'm so glad you could rejoin us, Mr. Bailey, Miss Peters said sternly. Did you have a nice nap? Connor turned bright red. So if he's turning bright red, how do you think he's feeling? I'm so sorry, Miss Peters, he apologized, trying to be as genuine as possible. Sometimes, when you talk for long periods of time, I doze off. No offense, I can't help it. You fall asleep in my class at least twice a week, Miss Peters reminded him. Well, you do talk a lot. Before he could stop himself from saying it, Connor knew it was the wrong thing to say. A few of his students had to bite their hands to stop from laughing. I recommend you stay awake while I teach, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters threatened. Connor had never seen anyone squint their eyes so tightly without shutting them before. Unless you know enough about fairy tales to teach the lesson yourself, she added. I probably do, Connor said. Once again, he spoke without thinking. I mean, I know a lot of stuff about this, that's all. Oh, really? Miss Peters never backed down from a challenge, and every student's worst nightmare was that they be her challenger. All right, Mr. Bailey, if you're so knowledgeable, answer this question. Connor gulped. In the original tale of Sleeping Beauty, how many years does the princess sleep before she is awoken by true love's first kiss? Miss Peters asked, studying his face. All eyes were on him, impatiently waiting for the slightest indication that he didn't know the answer. But fortunately, for Connor, he did. 100, Connor answered. Sleeping Beauty slept for 100 years. That's why the castle grounds were covered with vines and stuff, because the curse affected everyone in the kingdom, and there was no one to garden. Mrs. Peters didn't know what to say or do. She frowned down at him immediately, immensely surprised. This was the first time he had ever been correct when she put him on the spot, and she certainly had not expected it. Try to stay conscious, Mr. Bailey. Lucky for you, I used my last attention slip this morning, but I can always make more, Miss Peters said, and promptly walked to the front of the classroom to continue her lesson. So be thinking about Miss Bailey. Does she remind you of your teacher? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing if she did? What do you think? Would you like Miss Peters as a teacher? I don't know if I would. Connor sighed with relief, and all the red drained from his face. His eyes met his sister's. Even she was surprised that he had gotten the answer right. Alex hadn't expected Connor to remember any fairy tales. Now, class, I want you to get all of your literature books. I want you to all get out your literature books. Turn to page 170 and read Little Red Riding Hood, quietly to yourselves, Miss Peters instructed. The students did as they were told. Connor made himself as comfortable as possible at his desk and began reading. The story, the pictures, the characters were all so familiar to him. Now it has like a little apple break right here. Let's see what that means. Also, before we start reading that, what's the setting of this part? Because remember when I read you the prologue, we were inside a prison. Is this part the setting a prison? Do you think it takes place past, present, or future? And what time of day do you think it is? Now remember where they are. Where are they? 1, 2, 3. They're at school, aren't they? So what time of day do you think this is taking place? All right, so I'm going to start reading after they put the apple, and we're going to talk about, well, what was that apple there for? One of the things Alex and Connor looked forward to most when they were very young had been trips to see their grandmother. She lived in the mountains in the heart of the woods in a tiny house that could be best described as a cottage, if such things still existed. It was a long journey, a few hours by car, but the twins loved every minute of it. Their anticipation would grow as they traveled up the winding roads through the endless trees, and when they crossed the yellow bridge, the twins would excitedly exclaim, "We're almost there! We're almost there!" Once they arrived, their grandmother would greet them at the door with arms wide open and hugs so tight they would almost pop. So what has changed since that apple was put? Where are we now? It's the setting, isn't it? So it indicated we're changing locations. New, kind of like in a drama, it would be a new scene. "Look at you two. You've both grown a foot since the last time I saw you," Grandma would say, even if they hadn't, and then would lead them inside, where a freshly batch baked of cookies waited for them. Their father had grown up in the woods and would spend hours each day telling the twins of his adventures as a kid. All the trees he climbed, all the streams he'd swum, and all the ferocious animals he barely escaped. Most of his retellings were highly exaggerated, but they loved this time with him more than anything else in the world. "Someday when you're older, I'll take you to all the secret places where I used to play," their father would tease them. He was a tall man with kind eyes that would wrinkle whenever he smiled, and he smiled quite a bit, especially when he was teasing the twins. At night, the twins' mother would help their grandmother cook dinner, and after they had eaten, as soon as the dishes were done, the family would sit around the fireplace. Their grandmother would open her big storybook, and she and their father would take turns reading the twins fairy tales until they fell asleep. Sometimes the Bailey family would be up until sunrise. They told stories with such detail and passion that it didn't matter how many times the twins heard the same story. They were the best memories any child could ask for. Unfortunately, the twins hadn't been back to their grandmother's cottage in a very long time. Are you guys wondering why? What's going on? What has happened that they haven't been to grandmother's cottage in a very long time? Hopefully when we read, we're going to find more clues about that, right? And look what has appeared. It's another apple. So what do you think is going to change? Let's see if we're right. "Mr. Bailey!" Mrs. Peters shouted. Connor had dozed off again. "Sorry, Miss Peters," he bellowed back, sitting straight up in his seat like a soldier on guard. Like a soldier on guard, they're comparing Connor to. Figurative language, right? If looks could kill, Connor would have been dead from the scowl she was sending him. So what was this apple for? It changed the 1, 2, 3, the setting, right? Another setting change. "What did we think of the real Little Red Riding Hood?" the teacher asked her class. A girl with frizzy hair and thick braces raised her hand. "Miss Peters?" the frizzy hair girl asked. "I'm confused." "And why is that?" Miss Peters asked, as if asking, "What on earth could you possibly be confused about, idiot?" "Because it says the big bad wolf is killed by the hunter," the frizzy hair girl explained. "I always thought the wolf was just upset because the other wolves in his pack made fun of his snout, and he and Little Red Riding Hood became friends until the end." At least, that's what happened in the cartoon I used to watch when I was little. Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes as far back into her head as she could, as she could have, as if she could have seen what was behind her. That, she said with a clenched jaw, is exactly why we're having this lesson. The frizzy-haired girl became wide-eyed and sad. How could something so dear to her have been wrong? For homework, Miss Peters said. The room unanimously slumped in their seats. You are to pick your favorite fairy tale and write a paper due tomorrow on the real lesson the tale is trying to teach us. Miss Peters went to her desk and the students began working on their assignment, with little class time remaining. Mr. Bailey, Miss Peters summoned Connor to her desk. A word. Connor was in deep trouble, and he knew it. He cautiously stood up and walked to Mrs. Peters' desk. The other students gave him sorrowful looks as he walked by, as if he were walking to his executioner. Yes, Miss Peters, Connor asked. Connor, I'm trying to be sensitive about your family situation, Miss Peters said, glaring at him over the frames of her glasses. Family situation. 2 words Connor had heard too many times in the last year. Do we know what family situation Connor has right now? I want to know, don't you? However, Miss Peters continued, there is a certain behaviors that I just will not tolerate in my classroom. You're constantly falling asleep in class. You don't pay attention. Not to mention, you quiz and test very poorly. Your sister seems to be functioning just fine. Perhaps you could follow her example. Are you making any other inferences about Miss Peters' personality based on how she's comparing the twins and how they're handling their family situation? It was a comparison that felt like a kick to the stomach, and every time someone made it. Indeed, Connor was not like his sister by any means, and he was always punished because of it. If this continues, I will be forced to have a meeting with your mother. Do you understand? Miss Peters warned him. Yes, sir. Ma'am. I meant ma'am. I'm sorry. It just hadn't been the best day. Okay, then. You have a seat. Connor slowly walked back to his seat, his head hanging, slightly lower than it had all day. More than anything, he hated feeling like a failure. Alex had watched the entire conversation between her brother and her teacher. As much as her brother embarrassed her, she did feel for him as only a sister could. Alex flipped through her literature book, deciding on which story to write about. The pictures weren't as colorful and exciting as they had been in her grandmother's book, but seeing all the characters she had grown up reading about made her feel at home, a feeling that had recently become a rarity. Are you thinking, why does Alex not typically feel at home? If only fairy tales were real, she thought. Somebody could have a wand and magically make things how they used to be. That's the end of chapter 1, guys. So next time should be tomorrow. We're going to read chapter 2. It says, The Longer Walk Home. So I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day. Love you. Bye. Miss you.